good to go, Jay.
Okay. Thanks everybody for joining this afternoon. I would like to call this meeting to order and read the statement for the beginning of the meeting, which reads, the Equitable Housing Strategy Subcommittee meeting has now commenced. It is September 17th at 1 p.m. Is that right? Yes, September 17th at 1 p.m. We ask all commissioners and guests to mute yourselves until called upon to speak to avoid feedback and background noise. For those who have dialed in using the call-in number, to unmute to speak, dial *6 on your phone. Also, prior to speaking, please announce who you are to identify yourself. As a reminder, this meeting is being recorded. We ask that you only use the chat function to request to speak or to announce that you are leaving the meeting so that we can track quorum. Also, to comply with the state open meeting law, attendance and votes will be done by way of roll call using audio, not by using the chat function. And with that, I would like to welcome Jason Djurdjevic to the meeting today. He is going to be presenting the Mapping Racist Covenants project, which I'm sure many of us know about, but I thought it would be good to get the presentation to the subcommittee as well as to those who attend and then also view our meetings after the fact online. But before I turn it over to Jason, I just realized that I forgot to do roll call. So with that, I will do roll call. Vicky Cusino, I believe she is absent today. Lori Mazurba.
Present.
Ray Winch.
Present.
Kenny Wong.
Present as well.
And Jay Young, I am here. Is that everybody? I believe. Yes. And with that, I will turn it over to Jason. Thanks so much for joining us, Jason. And the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jay. Thank you all for inviting me here today to talk about the Mapping Racist Covenants project and for your important work in equitable housing and policy strategy in Tucson. I see some familiar faces. It's good to see you all again. And I'm happy to share with you a quick overview of the Mapping Racist Covenants project. And of course, I want to make this a conversation. So if there's any places throughout the presentation where you want to ask a question or get more insight, I'm happy to elaborate. So let me go ahead and share the presentation. Can you all see the slides? Okay, great. So a few introductory slides before I sort of get started with the overview and findings from our project. This work is not possible without the generous support of the U of A libraries, which we received a Digital Borderlands grant, which funded our work. And that Digital Borderlands grant was actually funded by the Mellon Foundation. So I'm grateful to both the U of A libraries and the Mellon Foundation for supporting our work. I also want to give a shout out. As many of you know, our project was community-led, and we actually had 5 community partners in particular that worked with us on this project. And one of the reasons for ensuring that the project was community-led is that we wanted to center life experiences of individuals and communities that were most affected by racist covenants and other forms of housing injustice. And so the 5 groups that partnered with us are listed on the screen: African American Museum of Southern Arizona, Tucson Chinese Cultural Center, of course, the City of Tucson, the Tucson Jewish Museum and Holocaust Center, and the Southwest Fair Housing Council. Each of the organizational partners were able to nominate 2 to 3 people to our advisory board. And so our project advisory board is listed here with all of our advisory board members. And so the advisory board was absolutely instrumental in the success of the project. They had about 5 or 6 different responsibilities. I'm not going to detail all of them today, but some examples, I'll give you sort of three of them. They were fostering partnerships between the community that they represented and us as researchers. They shared local knowledge and lived experiences with respect to racist housing covenants and other forms of housing discrimination. And they also provided feedback on our research, as well as our research trajectory and outputs. And so, again, I just want to underscore that the success of the project is thanks to, in large part, to this volunteer board. So thank you all to the partners and to the board members. It takes an academic village to pull off this type of project. And so while I directed the project, I wanted to give a shout out to a group of talented, thoughtful, and dedicated researchers, Yoga Korgalkar, who's my colleague in geography, Chris Cullen, who's a emeritus librarian at the U of A Library, and then two students, Liz Wilshin and Claire Holloway, that were an amazing team. And this work is not possible without them. So, and I also have a shout out to volunteers in a few slides. So, who are also very important with respect to the project. So I know a lot of you are familiar with the project and you're familiar with racist covenants. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on the background of the project, but I do want to highlight some of the more important takeaways. I do find, in terms of talking about this project throughout the city of Tucson, most folks are not aware of what a CCR is, covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Many folks don't know that CCRs in the 20s all the way through 1968 contained racist language. So usually giving this an overview and the rationale for why racist covenants were implemented is definitely an important part of presenting the project. A little bit about the aims of the project. What were our goals? And to what extent did we obviously achieve those goals now that the project results are complete? A little bit about considerations and limitations, research process, a little bit about data, key takeaways from the project, and then the actual interactive map, which allows you to look up your subdivision or neighborhood to find out whether your particular area has racist CCRs. So CCRs, as again, many of you are familiar with, refer to covenants, conditions, and restrictions. And essentially, these are sets of rules that govern a real estate parcel. They're an agreement between you and your neighbors. In Tucson, they typically look relatively similar across subdivisions. The language, that I'm showing you here is from the Encanto Park subdivision. It has rules about structures. In this case, only one-story private family residences can be built. No advertising billboards, no temporary house trailers or tents, and no livestock, right? And so those rules are fairly commonplace across Tucson. I should also mention then that, and I should have probably done this in the beginning, obviously the topic that we're talking about contains racist language and incendiary and insensitive language from historical periods. And we did not sensitize that language as part of the process. So I just want to sort of give a warning that some of the language that I'm going to present here today is overtly racist and so maybe triggering for some individuals. I just think it's important to mention that. So in the Encanto Park subdivision, the sixth covenant specifically says that no house may be rented or leased to any person of Black or Asian descent unless those people are domestic servants to the owners or tenants of the property. And so the racist language was included in many conditions, covenants, and restrictions in the United States, as I mentioned earlier, really following the Buchanan v. Worley Supreme Court case in 1917, which, as many of you know, outlawed municipal racial zoning ordinances, but it was silent against whether private parties could do this type of work. And so that's when you really start to see racist language and covenants, conditions, and restrictions taking off in the 20s and all the way through really up until the Fair Housing Act of 1968. The geography of these racist CCRs is extensive, not only in Tucson, but also across the United States. One of the reasons why we still have the language in many parts of Tucson is that we have perpetuity clauses written into many of our covenants, conditions, and restrictions. And in this case, for the Encanto Park subdivision, the last covenant, covenant number 15, there's a lot of text here, but it essentially says that the CCRs will remain in effect until 1972, at which they're renewed every 10 years. Any of them can be modified with 3/4 of residential vote. But the language regarding the racial restrictions shall live forever. And so that's why 2023, 2024, right? Recent years, people are still having to sign CCRs that contain racist language, even though they've been illegal since 1968, because many neighborhoods and subdivisions haven't been able to remove the language because of these perpetuity clauses. Which is essentially why the only remedy around this, and again, I caveat, I'm not a lawyer, but the only remedy was to have the state get involved to allow neighborhoods and subdivisions to be able to bypass these perpetuity clauses, and if they want to do so, remove the racist language. So the rationale for including racist covenants, which I alluded to a little bit earlier, is like other discriminatory housing practices, including the municipal exclusionary zoning, which I mentioned earlier, Baltimore being the first city in the United States to pass such a law back in 1911, I believe is the year. Redlining, blockbusting, unfair lending practices, racist CCRs were used under the justification of preserving property values and in particular, keeping neighborhoods white. The evidence we have from our analysis, if you look at the geography of racist covenants in Tucson and you compare it with racial segregation patterns, present racial segregation patterns today, they seem to still be doing their job in the sense that geographies of neighborhoods with racist covenants on balance tend to be less racially and ethnically diverse than the city of Tucson as a whole. And so I do think that is an important takeaway that is admittedly requires more research to sort of get our arms around. But that is important for us to think about. As I mentioned, covenants were enacted from the early aughts, really the 20s until 1968. They were ruled unenforceable by the Supreme Court in Shelley v. Kramer in 48, but we did find, even though there was this Supreme Court decision in 48, we did still find subdivisions in Tucson that did include racist language in the 50s and in the 60s, although it was much less common than the 30s and 40s prior to the Supreme Court case. I'll just tell you that we have a lot of evidence in the 30s and 40s as subdivisions were being developed that many developers were actually advertising covenants as a selling point for their particular subdivisions. And so you don't need to dig very far to find covenants mentioned in advertisements. This is actually an advertisement from the Arizona Daily Star back in 1931. I know the text is hard to read here, but this is for the El Encanto Estates near Country Club and 6th. And if I zoom in to that highlighted section, you can see the second to the last sentence of this, and with architectural, price, and race restrictions, right? So there was, developers were using race restrictions as a selling point for particular areas within the city of Tucson. So our objective was to explore the geography of racist conditions, covenants, and restrictions in Tucson neighborhoods by mapping any covenant that was enacted, racist covenant that was enacted between 1912 when Arizona became a state and in 1968. And our deliverables were twofold. an interactive web map that highlighted the geography of racist CCRs, and equally important, was navigable and user-friendly in allowing Tucsonans to determine whether their subdivision or neighborhood actually had a racist covenant. That's a really important part of this. So we wanted people to actually engage with their particular home, with their particular neighborhood, to understand the history of that location. And equally important, the second part is that we didn't want people necessarily to just trust us when we copied the racist text as to what it said. We wanted to provide a link to the actual CCR document, which was a bit of a heavy lift, just with respect to making sure that all those documents were scanned and digitized. And that's really not possible without the cooperation and participation of the Pima County Recorder's Office, who were an amazing partner in this project, as well as the U of A Library, who were an equally important part of the project. And if you've played around with the website, you've probably discovered that when you actually click on the link to the actual CCR document, all those CCR documents are housed at the U of A Library in the campus repository, meaning that they will be there for people to actually access when prior to this, they actually had to go down to the recorder's office at the physical location to access the CCR document if they might have lost it when they purchased their home. There are a number of considerations and limitations, as with any study, and we've detailed these on the front page of our website. There is obvious with construction of race and ethnicity, both in terms of historical construction of race, that makes this a complicated and nuanced research project. And so careful thought people need to think carefully about that with respect to the data. Completeness, oral histories of discrimination, subdivisions versus individual parcels, the nuances of spatial data, and then just places that we were unable to locate. All of these are detailed on our website, and in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into them, but if you're interested in the limitations, you can read the explanations on our website. Our research process from a 30,000 foot level looked like this. We needed to start with obtaining the CCRs from the Pima County Recorder's Office. Many of the older CCRs were not digitized, and so that definitely made the process a little bit more challenging. We needed to search the CCRs for racist and other discriminatory language, which involved some OCR, optical character recognition, that we developed, which was actually pretty cool to look through the historical documents and then upload those to the database. And we didn't want to necessarily just trust the technology. We wanted to have humans involved to verify whether the data that we had were accurate and complete. And that's where our volunteers came in. And thanks to the volunteers, they really provided ensuring that we had a complete and accurate project. And in fact, these are the folks that helped us, including one person here on the call, Kenny. So thank you for helping us with respect to our work. This is not possible without the volunteer support. So a quick overview of the data. There are roughly 5,700 subdivisions in Pima County, and the number of subdivisions that were platted between 1912 and 1968 are roughly 1,300. We were able to verify that 756 subdivisions with CCRs that actually contain CCRs, and then 320 were unable to locate. Many of those are historical subdivisions that, and by historical, I mean sort of predating Arizona statehood, that we were unable to locate any document for. So there's 4 takeaways that I think is important for you all on the committee to know as you do your work around equitable housing in Tucson. The first one is that there's at least 209 subdivisions in Pima County that have racist CCRs. Another way of putting that is more than 1 in 4 subdivisions platted between 1912 and 1968 contain racist language. I know when I've given this data point in presentations across Tucson, some people sort of get confused, like, is that a lot of subdivisions? Is that not a lot? What does the geography of that look like? And so I've tried to come up with a different way of thinking about this. Almost 200,000 Tucsonans today, roughly 1 in 3 live in a subdivision that contains racist language. I think, in my opinion, that underscores a pretty expansive geography across the city of Tucson. That 1 in 3 Tucsonans lives in an area with a subdivision that contains racist language. As many of you have probably explored, this is the map that we created that illustrates the subdivisions with racist language. Let me just kind of give you a quick overview of this. It's zoomed out, so I know it's a little bit hard to get oriented, so I'll sort of start with that. This area right here where my mouse is downtown. And then the U of A is obviously over in this area. And so you really see that the number of subdivisions to the north of the university, to the northeast, and extending actually quite a ways east along the Broadway corridor, the Speedway corridor, the Grant corridor. In this dark maroon color, that means that the subdivision contains racist language. Anything in pink indicates that the subdivision does not contain racist language. And anything in gray means that the subdivision was developed after 1968 when racist CCRs became illegal. And so obviously we did not look at the geography of those particular areas. So in addition to those areas, you see there's areas south of I-10 and east of I-19. There's a pocket here that contain racist language. On the near west side, there's a pocket. It extends up into the foothills and then points north towards Oro Valley. And there's actually also a racist subdivision in Summerhaven at the top of Mount Lemon. So that's the overview of the geography, and we can talk more about that if you'd like it, either at the end of the talk or do folks have any questions about the map right now? Or any questions at all to this point? Okay. Takeaway number 2. The overwhelming majority of subdivisions in Pima County with racist CCRs excluded people of color by enacting white or Caucasian only clauses. 80% of the subdivisions with racist CCRs enacted this language. Then there was also a tendency to target specific racial and ethnic groups. The 2 racial and ethnic groups targeted most specifically based on our analysis were African American individuals. Roughly 70% of covenants in Tucson contain language targeting African Americans, and an equal percentage targeting Asian individuals. We've produced maps for each of those takeaways, and these are also obviously showing you static images here, but they're available as on our website as interactive maps. So this map is illustrating the subdivisions that excluded people of color, essentially using the white or Caucasian only racial restrictions. And there were 169 subdivisions that did follow this, this particular path. And then this map is illustrating the subdivisions that explicitly excluded African Americans. There were 145 subdivisions that specifically contain language excluding Black individuals. And on the next map is a very similar geography, 142 subdivisions that excluded Asian individuals. And again, I would encourage you, if you're interested in looking at this in more depth, you can, through the website, and I will actually show you this in a second, but you can actually select not only the geography of the particular racial ethnic groups that were targeted, you can also select the geography by looking at it by neighborhood by neighborhood. The last 2 takeaways are number 3 and number 4. Over half of the subdivisions in Tucson have perpetuity clauses. So again, And an interesting question though, that I don't know is that we're still trying to figure out with respect to comparing our work to other projects is to what extent is this unique to Tucson or not? I don't know how widespread perpetuity clauses are in the projects similar to ours across the country. So there's completed projects in Minneapolis. There's a completed project in Seattle. There's ongoing work in Milwaukee and Chicago. And so this is some future research that I'll be looking at, is to see how common were perpetuity clauses. I would imagine they're probably fairly common, but does our percentage map on to what other cities are seeing? I don't know the answer to that question at this point. We did identify 17 subdivisions that canceled or removed the racist language from their CCRs because they did not have perpetuity clauses. So those are also, the geography of those are also available on our website. I don't have the map as part of this presentation. Ray, go ahead.
Were those cancellation or removal of the racist language, you think, a result of this project, or did
No, it predated the project. So
those?
yeah, and actually it's an interesting question where like identifying those and talking to maybe the history, the neighborhood associations to understand the history of when that happened and why, I think would actually be really fascinating. And I have not done that as part of this research to this point, but maybe something that the committee would want to take on, or somebody within HCD, I think it would be really interesting. So I'll just sort of show you a quick overview here. This is actually the splash page when you get to the website, the first thing you get is sort of a content warning and a disclaimer that you have to agree to. That gives you, and also gives you an overview of the project. So a few highlights with respect to the map, and I'll just say there's a lot of data embedded in the website. We've tried to be as thorough and as thoughtful as possible. The downside of that is it can be fairly complicated. So I do believe it is still of interest and navigable for the average Tucsonan. However, for an expert housing audience like you all, I do think there's some elements to the website that may be of interest. And so I do want to spend a little bit of time just covering that. The first thing is number one. If you click on this how to use the map feature, and I should stop for a second. We're talking about the website address, which I did not put up on the slides. mappingracistcovenants.org is the web address. The how to use the map feature is a detailed explanation of everything that's available in the map. So I would actually recommend, especially for you all who are experts in housing, to start there. Number two is down here on the bottom right. That's the legend, which we've already talked about. All the dark maroon colors indicate subdivisions with racist CCRs. Number three is where the address bar, where you can literally type in your address and it will geolocate your house, and a pop-up box will appear, which will tell you the subdivision name, the neighborhood name, the year in which the CCR was implemented, if it contains a CCR, whether there's racist language, the racial and ethnic groups that were targeted, and then an actual link to the covenant, condition, and restriction document if it exists. And then finally, number four, this is what I was alluding to a few slides ago. If you want to look at the geography of the neighborhoods that restricted Asian individuals, for example, you would hit this drop-down button and select Asian, and then the map would come up and show you all the subdivisions that included racist language towards Asians. Any question? I know I really went through that really quickly. I do want to mention, and I don't actually have this. Oh, number five. I forgot number five. So number five, if you click on that layer button, that's what it is. It allows you to look at the racial and ethnic segregation in Tucson in 1960 and in 2020 from the latest census. And so if you click on the buttons for those particular layers, you can actually toggle back and forth between the geography of the racist covenants that I'm showing you here and the geography of the population of color across, I think we use census tracts. I forget, actually. I should, maybe it's a smaller geography, might be block groups, where you can actually then look at the intersection between the geography of racist covenants and racial, present day and historical racial and ethnic segregation. Any questions on that before I move on to the next slide? Yeah, Kenny, go ahead.
Thanks for presenting this work, Jason. And I've used the mapping project in my classes a few times. And I'm very curious about the 1960 census data there. Sometimes it looks very different from the 2020 information. I was wondering if you might say a little bit more about that, about perhaps the categorization that might have been used at the time, or just other background information you might have.
Yeah, it's actually a limiting. I mean, the 1960 data is limiting in many ways. I think the two ways in which I would sort of talk about it are, the way it's limiting is, number one, the geographies are much bigger. So like the tracts are much bigger because the city's population was much smaller. So, and then the footprint was much smaller as well, right? So that's just a product of how small Tucson was relative to where we are now in 1960. The second thing is that you're right, Kenny, the racial and ethnic groups in 1960 are very, very different than what they are in 2020. And that was definitely a limiting factor for what we were able to do with the 1960 data. I actually think this is, I actually think this might be a separate conversation for this group and maybe other groups across the city. I actually think there's more work to do in this area in terms of building a story of racial and ethnic segregation historically and across Tucson by looking at specific racial and ethnic groups. Due to limited funding with this project, we were only able to look at essentially people of color, but I think breaking it out by racial and ethnic group would be really important. But back to my original point, if people are interested in understanding the construction of race by the federal government in 1960, which I think, Kenny, you're sort of alluding to, I would recommend people going to racebox.org, which is a website that essentially takes a snapshot of the race and ethnicity question in every census dating back to 1790. What folks will see is that, and I think, well, maybe not see, but what folks need to know is that in 1960, people were only able to identify as one race, whereas in 2020, people are able to identify as more than one race. So if you were multiracial in 1960, you essentially had to check a box. In 2020 data, we allow for people to identify as more than one race. So they're very different questions, obviously. I mean, encompassing a 40-year period. 60-year period. So there's a number of caveats with the race data. And again, I think I don't typically talk about this with the general audience that I speak to about the project, but you all as an expert audience, this is an expert level question. And so I think that, without going into the actual categories that are constructed in 1960, that this is really, I think, an ongoing conversation for us to sort of think about with respect to getting a better sense of historical geographies of racial segregation versus present day patterns. I hope that answered your question. I know that was a long response, but racebox.org is the site that I think folks should look at. Any other questions? I just have 2 slides left, so I'm almost complete. Go ahead, Ray.
For being able to toggle between the covenants and the current racial demographics, what was it that you were doing on the screen there?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. I usually have 2 windows open. So like 2 tabs. One tab is this map that I'm showing right here. And the second tab is another our website, except it's showing the race geography. And so then you can look at the two tabs simultaneously to see the overlap. I plan to do a little bit more work on that in the coming weeks and months, that I think will do a better job of illustrating the sort of correlation and overlap between the two geographies, because I do think it is important for us to think about.
And then to find that other map on your website, it's an already created map somewhere on there of the racial demographics in the city?
Yeah, it's this number 5. You see like this layers button in the top right. That's
Okay.
how you get, and I buried it there because it's for more advanced data users.
Okay.
And I didn't want people to get tripped up by that when they went to the site.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay, so the last 2 slides, I'll just say that many of you have probably followed this pretty closely, but the project has had a number of important impacts in and throughout Pima County. The first one is Senate Bill 1432, which is a new Arizona law. It was signed into law by Governor Katie Hobbs in March of this year, and I believe it went into effect on Friday. That allows homeowner associations, individuals, and subdivisions to remove the racist language and bypass the perpetuity clause. So I've been in conversation with neighborhoods across Tucson that are already engaged in this work, and having conversations about how they want to amend their CCRs to remove the language. So those conversations are being had, and important conversations about historical and present day forms of housing segregation as part of that larger conversation, which I think is also very important. The second impact that you all may be familiar with is that the story was covered by KVOA back in August. The Sugar Hill Neighborhood Association has sent a petition to the city of Tucson Parks to change Mansfield Park, which is the park in the middle of the Sugar Hill neighborhood, to change the name to Doris J. Thompson Park, who is a longtime civil rights leader and resident of Sugar Hill. This is actually based on Sugar Hill's analysis of the CCRs in and around Sugar Hill, finding that Mr. Mansfield had developed some of those areas back in the 50s, and specifically targeted African Americans from living in the subdivisions that he and his wife had developed. And so that proposal is currently in front of city parks, and I believe they're currently seeking public comment on the proposed name change. So that discovery by Jack Anderson and Sadie Shaw in the Sugar Hill neighborhood is a result of the Mapping Racist Covenants project. And I want to thank them for leading that important work. So that's pretty much, Jay, I think I'm on time. I think we said 40 minutes. So I tried to keep my promise to you. And so the website is listed here, which I already mentioned. And of course, I'm happy to answer any questions that people might have regarding the project. And again, I really appreciate the invitation and the fact that I could be with you all today to share some of the important takeaways and insights from our work on the Mapping Racist Covenants project.
Thanks so much, Jason. Any questions at this point? I know a number of us have seen this project and worked with it quite a bit. So just want to give any last chance for questions or comments.
I just wanted to say thanks again. I appreciated the explanation around the census information. had a hard time kind of framing that in various situations. But that's a great resource, the racebox.org.
Thanks, Kenny. Anybody else? Thanks again, Jason, for doing this presentation. I know you've been doing it a lot, and it's just shows the impact of this work. And I think, the reason I wanted to have you today is, originally our subcommittee was called the Housing Desegregation Subcommittee, and we've since changed our name. But I really wanted to make sure that we continue to center the role that housing segregation has played in Tucson and continues to play. And I just, was really heartened by the comment that you made that there are already a number of people and subdivisions that are acting to, address the racist covenants in the deeds, and just what an impact that this project has had to get this information out to the world. I think when I started in fair housing 15 years ago, very, very few people were really understood the impact that, segregation plays and how, it was put in place by many different levels of, government, private citizens, real estate agents, all of the above. And I think it's important for us to continue to center this because, one of the other things that we've talked about recently, both as a subcommittee and as a full commission is, how do we recognize and address past harms that have happened, and understanding that, that's a big impediment to creating more equity, particularly in housing in Tucson. So, the need to just continue to dismantle the systemic racism that, continues to plague our communities due to this legacy. So anyway, there's just some of my thoughts and comments, and again, want to thank you for your work. And I do think that this is the biggest thing in terms of, what's gone on in Tucson to really elevate this topic that, is so fundamental to housing and just equity in general. So again, appreciate your time and effort with this. And I guess I do have a question, actually. I think I've probably asked you this before, but I'll ask you again. What are your thoughts about, now that you have done this project and the information is out there, have you thought about ways that this information can be further operationalized? And really what I mean by that is how this information can be used to, address current and future policy in the city. I know it's a big question, but I'll ask it anyway, both for you and anybody else that wants to chime in.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. I appreciate the comments and the question. I would say I want to start out actually by just underscoring, and I didn't really get a chance to cover this in the presentation just due to time constraints, but covenants really are, the story of covenants goes along with the story of redlining. And so if you go back to the FHA maps and the literature from the 1930s from the FHA, the way in which those, and we have some of those documents available on our website related to Tucson, the covenants were used alongside redlining as a way as really tools of discrimination. And the reason that covenants are less understood than redlining is because the redlining maps were already produced, right? And those were available in the 30s. And covenants were never mapped. They were buried in archives, in jurisdictions across the country. And so the reason that I'm saying this is the way in which to sort of getting at your question is for us to really understand the depth of the geography and the extent to which these things are so prevalent across the country is going to require essentially project by project, city by city doing this type of work. Dedicated researchers in Arizona would be, literally every city. And so I think the more work that we do around this topic to illustrate the geography of housing discrimination historically gives us a better sense of understanding the inequities today, which then really gets a better sense of figuring out policy prescriptions. It's interesting because Arizona has now joined a group of states that have passed legislation to make it easier for people to remove the racist language, which in my opinion is a good thing, to address that historical wrong. But then the policy question about how do we address and ameliorate the sort of historical housing discrimination. Some of the states that have passed legislation, fewer of them have actually done that work. But I think what Washington did, I think, is an interesting proposal. I think you and I might have talked about this before, but so essentially, and I believe I have this right, but they assessed a fee, and I don't remember I think it was $100 on every real estate transaction in the state of Washington. And then that fee went into a pool that essentially raised $25 to $30 million, I believe it was annually. And then those were resources available as low interest loans to Washington residents that could then show how, if they were able to demonstrate being marginalized by racist covenants, could then apply for low interest loans from that pool, right? And that's just one idea. I believe there are other ideas as well. But that question is something that I think we should be having now in Tucson and across the state of Arizona. So thank you for asking that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that answer. Go ahead, Kenny.
Loved hearing about that example, just some of the creative possibilities. I was wondering, so as these laws are passed, allowing the easier removal of the language, just wanted to make sure I'm understanding right, because these are recorded with each parcel, each property within the subdivision. I can't remember, is there standard language of it being completely removed? Is it striked through? Do these generally just tend to disappear over time as, they stop being recorded, or modified versions are recorded with the next transactions?
Great question, Kenny. That was an important part of the discussion and has been an important part of the discussion, not only in Arizona, but across the country. Many people do not want the original document edited, right, for historical research purposes. So what my understanding is, what this law does, and it was designed to do this, is allow homeowners, individuals, and HOAs to amend the document, right, which is essentially to produce a more updated version of the CCR that if a couple was to move into a particular neighborhood, and they got the amended document as part of that real estate process would not include the racist language if the neighborhood decided to eliminate it. But if they wanted to go back to the original CCR at the recorder's office or through our website to read what the original read, they would obviously see that it contained racist language if it so did. Does that make sense? Okay. And I think, like you alluded to something, Kenny, which I think is important, is neighborhoods are taking different approaches to what they want to do. Do you strike through the text and leave it in the document? Do you black out the text, essentially redact it? Do you delete the paragraph? Do you add a footnote about historical housing discrimination? Like, there are a number of, there's no right answer, I think. There's different approaches that have, advantages and disadvantages, and that will be up to the individual homeowner as well as the HOA or the neighborhood as to how best to proceed.
This also brings to mind another piece of the puzzle for me that, I've learned about over the years is, I feel like first what kind of came up was the redlining, then I, understood about the covenants, but also, in many, many places throughout this country, you had redlining, you had racist covenants, and then you essentially had racist terrorism. And, people of color, their houses were firebombed, people were driven out of neighborhoods. And I think the extent to which that happened is really not very well understood. So, it's obviously maybe an even touchier subject, but something else that could be, researched, in terms of, neighborhood on neighborhood violence or neighbor on neighbor violence. I think that's a big piece of the puzzle as well. And then I think, I would just maybe conclude the presentation in terms of, I think that, again, the more that people understand about this history, the more it allows for creative solutions to deal with it. Because I think that, a lot of people are still under the impression that, segregation and the, geography of segregation is really just the way that the market has kind of dictated things. And, people are choosing to live where they want to live. And, why do we need to do anything if the market has just kind of dictated this to be so? But, if you obviously look at the CCNRs and redlining, it really wasn't the market. The market was socially engineered to create these patterns. So, the more we understand it, I think the more willing folks are to really explore some more creative policy solutions. At least that's the hopeful take I have on it. So if there are no other thoughts or comments, yeah, go ahead, Ray.
One question I have for you, Jason, is, well, I guess two, is one, if you have a written description of that example you used earlier about the fee that was then being used for housing equity, I'd love to see that. And then the other is, so one of the goals of the subcommittee and of the committee as a whole is looking at recognizing where the city of Tucson has been complicit in perpetuating housing inequities and of making recommendations to mayor and council of ways to address that. I'm wondering if you have, this was a question was kind of brought up in some ways, but has your research is looking specifically at this map of how housing segregation has happened in Tucson. Would love to dive a little bit deeper with you and with others about how we might then be using that to address what the city could be doing now.
I'd love to be part of that conversation and think more carefully about it. I do think it's really important. I will just say that due to the limitations of the funding that we had available to us to do the work, we sort of were only able to reach so far. And then as a result of making the research available, there's been a lot of other interesting intersectional questions, including sort of the intersection between housing discrimination, basically the geography of covenants, and unequal health outcomes, and all these, and I won't go through all of them, but I've been involved in some of those conversations with researchers across Tucson, policy professionals, sort of planners, sort of thinking about those things. So the reason I bring it up, Ray, is because I think actually having sort of what are the next steps now that we have these data, how do we prioritize the research and the recommendations for policy, kind of like giving us a North Star as to what's next. I think, I mean, I would love to be have that conversation with this committee and with others across the city to sort of figure out, including Larissa and her staff at the Office of Equity, to really sort of chart our path forward.
Any other thoughts or comments? Well, Jason, you definitely can count on this subcommittee to help further your research and move the ball forward, whatever that looks like. So don't hesitate to contact us if we can support or anything like that. So again, Jason, thanks so much for your time. Great presentation as always, and it's certainly helpful for us as a subcommittee and as a commission to continue to address housing segregation and housing equity as a whole. So thank you again.
Great. Thanks all. Appreciate it. Good to see you. And thanks again for inviting me.
Take care.
Take care.
Okay, number 4 on the agenda, moving on, is the Office of Equity update. Larice, I will turn it over to you. I guess maybe I'll just frame it a little bit also by saying that Larice and I were able to meet this past Friday and have some regularly scheduled meetings coming up to discuss both the work of the the full commission and also of this subcommittee. So with that, Larissa, I'll turn it over to you and we can kind of go back and forth if that makes sense, or
Yeah. Yes. Well, good afternoon. It's good to see everyone. Yes, as Jay mentioned, we have been, playing a little bit of tag, trying to get on each other's calendar to make sure that we can open up the opportunity to have a connected and integrated working relationship as it pertains to the work that the Office of Equity is doing and how to support the commission, but then also the subcommittee as well. So I know that Laura, was it this meeting or the larger meeting that Laura presented at?
It was here.
Okay, perfect.
Last subcommittee meeting. Yeah.
So I understand that Laura Sharp and my team came and presented our Tucson equity data strategy, the work that we're trying to do to really make sure that we are shifting the thinking the way that the city of Tucson does work, especially around equity. Most of the time you hear folks saying, oh, well, that doesn't apply to us as an organization, or how is this important and relevant to my department service delivery? Really being able to point to how the use of data has impact through our services and our communities is really important. And I would say that that's the strategy around leading with demographic data. I've worked in organizations where, we've had very different key indicators where we probably entered roadmap data and, maybe housing information as well, along with demographic data. But having our equity index really focus on demographic data was intentional by the design that the demographics of our city won't change that much in that regular as some of the other programs or policies or data that's around pavements and things might. So really being able to use that as a foundational layer. And from, I'm sure, Laura's presentation, you can see that how, whether it's bus stops or how we are trying to think about pool hours in the city, how we can use that information to really think about informing our decision-making as an organization. And I wanted to highlight some of the things that we are working on using that Tucson equity data strategy. And then I'll talk a little bit about the equity action plan, and then leave the rest of my time or floor that I have to really just be in conversation with you all about what is on the horizon. What do you want to see? How can the Office of Equity really kind of take a step further to block and tackle? I use that terminology in my work because a lot of this work is blocking and tackling, making sure that one, are we setting up the right parameters to create safe spaces to have honest conversations and dialogues, but then also tackling to the sense of like, how are we going to actually operationalize this work? So some of the programs that we're working from using our Tucson equity data strategy. So I talked a little bit about, or I just dropped that we used it for pool data to kind of help support our park and recs department and looking at what pools should be staying open, having additional extended hours. And we just kind of mapped with that pool data and being able to help determine that. One thing that's coming up from Councilmember Cunningham's office, they used our equity index to determine, so they got their new nice building, they're trying to determine what type of community services they should offer in that building, and they use the demographic data from the NDC to be able to say, okay, this is the demographics of the community, do we have a large active older adult population in the community that we might need to offer services that might support their needs, things like that, or do we have families, right? Is it more family social services that might need to have offices that can be able to support and bring services in that community? So really using that as one of the ways that they've used that. Another way that the index has been used, it's definitely with the Grow Tucson and the Trees program that's happening with Nicole's office. That work has also been continuing to move forward to making sure that, how are we making sure, one, how we're mapping and the implementation of where we're planting these trees, but then also kind of projecting that future growth map too. It's not super set in stone, but we're really trying to focus on the prosperity initiative. That's kind of like been this vague conversation that's been happening here and there for like the last 6-9 months with the equity office, the housing department, the city manager's office as well. So kind of figuring out what relationship the work that we're doing plays and how we can kind of overlap that to make sure we're meeting those metrics in relationship to what the county's doing around the prosperity initiative. I think those are some big ones that I can concretely point to of how we're using the index. I'll take a break if there's any questions about any of those. Great.
I was just going to
Yes.
jump in, Luis, and mention one of the things that you and I talked about as well, and that we as a subcommittee have talked about a lot, is using the mapping project that y'all are working on to measure equity, going forward, so that we can, as a city, understand if we're improving equity or not. And the mapping project, really creates a great baseline and framework to do that. And as a subcommittee and as a full commission, thinking about how we can bridge the gap between HCD and other departments that are dealing with housing to, use this great tool that you guys have developed to really start that measurement process. So obviously that's not something that has happened, but something that I think you and I talked about. How can we bridge that gap so that we can really start measuring equity from year to year.
Yeah, absolutely, Jay. And I think that's a good caveat to the next part. If there's any other comments about how we're using the data strategy, but really get into the equity action plan. So for you all's informational purposes, we're underway in drafting the city's first equity action plan. I wrote an equity implementation plan, almost like an action plan, essentially from the day that I started working in the office, and really how I see us moving this work in the city of Tucson. And what I've done this past June is I invited the Equity Steering Committee, which is made up of our executive leadership team at the city. So every department director, and we had deputy directors a part of these sessions, but then also members from the city manager's office who sat in on these 3-4-hour workshop sessions to really help identify what is our equity priorities as an organization. For us to really think about how to move equity across the organization in our service delivery. So we were able to identify 3 key priorities, which is it's a diverse, inclusive workforce environment. So it's more about culture. We've looked at continuous improvement, so making sure that we're providing excellent service delivery, which truly also is trying to translate equitable service delivery. So making sure that the residents and constituents have access to the city services that we're offering. And then the third piece of that has been looking at that data strategy, right? So how do we make data-informed recommendations, data-informed decision-making, data-informed policy-driven outcomes, right? So those are the 3 priorities of the steering committee have come up with. And then they were given their 3 goals, and then they had to write action steps. So to get to this goal, whether it's data-informed decision-making, what are the action steps that it's going to take to reach that? What does success look like? And then they had to break down each action step to talk about, okay, what are each individual milestones to achieve that action step? So that plan is right now in draft with the consultants. I actually have a meeting tomorrow at 10 a.m. with our consultants so I have been taking the first look at the draft this past 2 weeks. They're trying to finalize a draft copy for us to have to bring back to community. Very transparent about the community feedback and engagement that our office is looking for from the equity action plan is to have feedback on what does success measures and measuring success in these different goals look like. So this will be definitely something that will come across you all's desk to be able to identify and look at. And essentially what we're hoping out of all of this, right, putting this equity action plan together for the city, one of the implementation strategies is by next spring, in Q1, every department in the city should have their own individualized department-specific equity action plan that feeds into the larger plan for the city, but every department will have their plan for them to take a look and analyze it based on those 3 different principles and the action steps that it takes to reach these outcomes. What does your department, what are your unique needs? What is your department challenges? How are you going to work on inclusive, diverse workforce culture, right, in your department? And what does that look like? And how does it benefit the overall benefit of the organization in the city? So that's what we're hoping for. That's what we're striving, moving for. That's the direction and implementation that I'm working towards. And that's the tone and culture container that I'm building with our executive leadership team and city leadership to have those end results for us as an organization. And I'll take a break on that.
Any thoughts, comments, or questions for Larice at this point? Okay.
Oh no, just wanted to applaud the effort with the census lookup tool and the information that's available by the neighborhoods. I think last month when Laura shared some of that, it was just really great to see how much information was out there at our fingertips. And yeah, I'm teaching a lot this semester. Also, something else that I've used within the classroom. So
Mhm.
just love that it's very public. It's out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for using it. Please continue to use it. Encourage everyone else that you run into to use it. That's really been the goal is, and I've been talking to Pima County and some of my colleagues at the state that like, once we're ready for this tool to like truly fully be a thing, like we want cross jurisdictional partners to use this, not just native and only for Tucson, but really wanted everyone else to be able to benefit for that. And we did win an award for it, so that's kind of cool. But I think the beauty of the award is just us showing that there is a different methodology and to shift our thinking about how we do our work, especially as local government. And I want to put Tucson on the map to be a change agent, to be a leader in this work, and to really think about, okay, are we truly trying to get to more equitable outcomes, or are we truly holding up continuous harmful institutional practices that's harming our communities, right? And I think that that's the challenge that I'm holding us as an organization to.
Something that I was just thinking about, Larice, is you mentioned the equity action plan, and this is a little bit different, but I think you mentioned that you were going to be taking that forward to mayor and council, and that that was a place where either the subcommittee, our subcommittee, or the full commission could potentially support your work, which kind of brings me to just that in particular, but also one of the things that you and I have talked about a lot is really wanting to support your work in the Office of Equity and to be a collaborative partner in this work, as opposed to not being one of the people you have to block and tackle, that we're actually collaborating and moving this ball forward down the field. So there's that for us, I think, to think about. But my question was, is the equity action plan incorporating or kind of vibing with the prosperity initiative? Or because I know the prosperity initiative is out there, and I think a lot of us are like, it's a great document, but like, how's it being integrated? Maybe that's the better question, if at all.
Yes, good question. So earlier this year, I think it was about March or April, I know it was right before the summer, that I've had a meeting with the housing department director, the deputy director at housing. There also was Liz Morales, who's one of our assistant city managers, and my team, myself and Laura Sharp. We've had conversations. I think we had about 3 conversations this spring about how does the Prosperity Initiative play and what relationship does that have towards Equity Action Plan. And when we were in the early stages of those conversations before the Equity Action Plan sessions happened, I think it came down to looking at the equity budget analysis. So that was our first whiff of taking a look at, okay, where in the equity budget analysis from this past cycle that departments have reported out on their budget, do we see pieces and factors of the Prosperity Initiative showing up? So we took that inventory and we've kind of been stagnant since, just to be super transparent. And I think we are now about to kick up those conversations again. Okay, we didn't see necessarily it being the place for the Equity Action Plan, but we do see that there is this big relationship with the Office of Equity, the mayor's office, housing, and all the other departments that need to play a critical role in how the Prosperity Initiative is showing up. So it is coming back up on the radar. I did run into the mayor's chief of staff last week, and we've chatted a little bit about it at the elevator, and I saw Liz Morales last week, and we've talked about it too. So I think those conversations are coming back up about what do we do with this and how do we track that progress and success.
Great. Any other thoughts or comments from committee members, or Larice, anything else that you would like to add or update us about?
No, I'm hiring. So if anybody want a job working in the equity office, I have 2 project manager positions that's open. One that's for employee engagement. So someone who's coming in, building employee capacity around diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, but then also helping write a citywide public engagement policy and working with boards and commissions. And then the other position is a project manager who is kind of like a right hand to me, working on those citywide projects. So the equity budget analysis, the equity action plan will be one of those really big projects. And then just supporting any other initiatives that come across from the city. I'm just one person, so just having some additional help would be awesome. So please, 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 please. It's not posted. It was posted, but the recruitments just that are going back out, they weren't filled at the time. So it's kind of more of like an email, word of mouth, send a resume, kind of get connected to me, share my information. But we're hoping to get some people in the door who's really committed to this work and want to champion for the city too.
So much for coming to the meeting and for your work. It seems like we're very aligned of what our goals are. So happy that we're weaving those connections more deeply, and glad that you and Jay are meeting outside of this meeting as well.
Yes, I was like, Jay, keep hunting me down. And his tenacity worked. I think I responded to his email like 2 months later, and I'm like, I'm so sorry. Like, please forgive me. Like, let's get together. And he was very forgiving. So yes.
I was I was camping in the redwoods, so I wasn't responding either. So no problem.
Yes, yes.
Summer in Tucson, you got to wait till fall. So no.
Right,
No
to do the work. Yes,
That's
yes.
right. All right. Anything else before we move on to the next agenda item? All right. Thanks, Therese.
Yep. Thank you.
Number 5 on our agenda is the HCD update. HCD, calling HCD.
Let's see. Ask Lena to go first, and then I'll add something.
Hi, everyone. Just a few things today. First is that the P-CHIP draft plan is out and available for public comment. I'm going to drop a link into the chat to that. There's a feedback form with the draft plan, so you can read the plan and provide your feedback on the different sections if you haven't already. The draft feedback period, it will be open for the public until next Tuesday on September 24th. So yeah, just open for about another week. We also have the community meeting tonight on Zoom. That will be an opportunity for people to address the plan, provide more feedback. There is also a section for asking questions on the P-CHIP grant making funding process that will be happening after the plan is adopted. So that is tonight on Zoom, and I will drop the link to registration in the chat as well. And then the other thing that I'm going to discuss before I hand it over to Neto is last subcommittee meeting brought up defining the term housing equity for the P-CHIP draft in our glossary. And I wanted to share a draft definition that City of Tucson HCD staff have drafted and would love some feedback, any edits or comments on it. So I'm just going to share my screen quickly so we can all see it. Okay, so if we can all see that. So we're suggesting first and foremost to, instead of calling it housing equity, we were going to think of defining it as equity in housing. Just to not confuse with like people's house, like how equity in their actual housing, just to separate those. But the draft language we have currently is addressing the challenges that prevent equal access to affordable and quality housing in areas that offer opportunity. Again, this is a draft, and we wanted to bring it to the subcommittee to get any feedback, any edits, suggestions, anything like that. So we can add it to the final P-CHIP in the glossary section. So yes, happy to hear any feedback on this now.
The thing that just jumped into my mind is, didn't we as a full commission define, was it just equity maybe that we defined? I'm just wondering where that might live and if that might be helpful.
Yeah, I think at the retreat, equity was defined. So, and I know that we also have the City of Tucson definition of equity from Laurisa's office. So we can definitely look at both of those to make sure that that kind of is also being added to this part of the definition.
Any thoughts, y'all, about this definition? Anything that's working, missing, additions?
And I can also say that I can send it out in an email to you all. And if you have feedback that you want to provide after you read it and digest it a little bit, happy to take that feedback over the next, I would say maybe week or so, so we can get it into the final draft.
I just wanted to say thanks for bringing this back to the subcommittee, and was reminded as well some of that the shared language documentation, some of the early commission founding language. But what I do like is it gives us it's starting to point a direction of what needs to be done as well. So providing that access or reducing the barriers that might exist. So I appreciate that thrust in the definition so far.
Thanks, Kenny. So, yeah.
I just pulled up real quick on the CEHD webpage. Down at the very bottom, there's a document of shared language.
Okay.
And for what it's worth, just equity, not equity in housing, but equity, at least in this document, is equity is a strategy to address people's needs based on their life and historical context. Prejudice, bias, and other social divisions disproportionately impact people's access to opportunity, requiring creative solutions for our community to live in a fair world where impacted people can recover and thrive. I guess this definition, the one that you're showing, is I think it is actually pretty concise and to the point. I like it to a certain extent, but one of the things that I think is not explicit in this definition, and I'm not saying it necessarily should be, but just kind of pointing it out, is the part about prejudice, bias, social divisions that are creating these inequities, and that that's kind of at the root of what needs to be addressed to have more equitable housing. So I don't know if it's worth making the definition more wordy to include that piece of the puzzle, because obviously, challenges that prevent equal access can encompass what I just mentioned. It's just not explicit in the definition. So, I don't know if that's useful here, but just wanted to point that out, at least based on what's in our shared language. And again, I don't have the definition that we created for equity in front of me to see how that, if they're similar or what, we came up with a different definition in February.
Yep. Yeah, I can, I think that's a good point. And I think in that challenges, we could use some stronger language to show more of those issues there. So I don't think it would make it too wordy. I think it would explain to people what some of those challenges are, especially if they were reading the definition for the first time, and kind of give it that context. So I think that's great feedback. Thank you. And I think if that's all the comments, I'll still send it or have Neto or Rachel send it around to you all in case any other comments come up, but I'll pass it over to Neto now to give if there are any.
Thanks, Lena. And yeah, I'll send out the draft language to the commissioners. Just a bit of news that HCD received a $500,000 Choice Neighborhoods Planning Grant from HUD. that will be directed to support the 29th Street Thrive initiative. And just a reminder that the Thrive 29 is bordered by Alvernon to Craycroft and 22nd to Golf Links. And we have been working there now for about 2 years now. And this is the third highly competitive HUD choice grant that the city has received. The first two were directed to Thrive in the 05. And of course, the second of those two was the $50 million choice grant that the city received last year. And we're really proud of the work that that our colleagues are doing. And Laura Lopez is the coordinator there in the Thrive 29. And that is our news for this afternoon.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, question. I saw in the newsletter this week about the community partner grants. Does HCD run that, or is that through where you just advertising that was happening?
You caught me there, Ray.
It's what
The
is
commu-
it?
It said they were through
Community
mayor and council, but
Yeah.
Mayor and Council. Okay,
Mhm.
that makes sense. So it's totally separate from PCHIP then. The PCHIP HCD administers, and the
Yeah.
community
Yeah.
partner grant
Mhm.
is through Mayor and Council.
Yeah, the PCHIP funding is separate, and that will be probably sometimes in late October. That funding process will start, or early November.
and the PCHIP funding process is CDBG. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Yes.
And I think there's a portion of it that does come from our general fund dollars from Tucson Mayor Council as well.
Any other comments or questions for HCD? All right. That takes us to number 6, which is our work plan, which has a number of topics under it. And I want to do a time check here because we're coming to the end of our time. And we've got number 6 and then agenda items number 7, which are action items for us. Action items for HCD is number 8, call to the audience, and next steps, followed by adjournment. So we don't have much time left to get through all of this and to also have a call to the audience. So I guess I haven't really thought this through, but I want to take the temperature of the group a little bit just to see what your thoughts are about discussing our work plan, and particularly the work plan and action items. Obviously we don't have much time to dig into them, but maybe we push that off until the next meeting. Or what are y'all's thoughts about the agenda for the rest of the meeting?
I'd like to be a part of that conversation, and I have another meeting at 2:30.
Okay. So, I mean, I think one of the things that we could do is try and reserve maybe the next meeting that we have next month to really look at the work plan, talk about the readings that we have shared, talk about equity issues and discuss action items. I think particularly in light of the connection that we have made with Larice and the Office of Equity and all of the different things going on. Does that sound like a good plan to everybody to just kind of skip that for this time? I do want to just ask before we move. Okay, so we're gonna move through number 6, consider that done. Moving on to number 7, are there any other action items for us that we want to put on the table or take to the full commission that we haven't discussed, or that we won't be able to take care of and address at our next subcommittee meeting? Okay. Seeing none, I will move on to number 9, which is call to the audience. This is a time when any member of the public may address the commission or the subcommittee. Due to time constraints, the total time allocated for this is 15 minutes. Individuals are allowed 3 minutes each. Due to open meeting law, commission members cannot discuss topics that are not on the agenda. Items brought up by the public may be considered as an agenda item for a future meeting. Is there anyone in the audience who would like to address the subcommittee?
We have one person in the audience, but no hand up yet.
Okay. Going once, going twice. Okay, moving on to agenda item number 10, our next steps. Create a draft meeting agenda for the next meeting, review the main points for the meeting to report to the full commission. So I think for the draft agenda for our next meeting, y'all, I think we're in agreement that we'll just really try and focus on number 6, agenda item number 6, kind of as it is, the work plan. And then the action items. Is there anything that you guys see in the work plan on our agenda today that either we want to not address next time, or anything that's not on our work plan list that we should put on there so that we can deal with it at our next meeting? I think it's pretty broad for the most part. I think we can, seems to me like we can probably talk about most anything that we would want to talk about regarding equity and housing, and HCD's doing, and all of those various things. So without further comment or suggestions, we'll just kind of leave it at that. Is that okay with everyone? Okay. And then for the main points to report to the full commission, obviously, I think the discussion with Jason and the presentation, and then our conversation with Larice. So I took pretty good notes, but those are, I think, the main things that I will bring up. And of course, if there is anything that I leave out or that others want to bring up at that summary, obviously feel free to do so. Anything else regarding next steps before we adjourn? Okay, with that, the meeting is adjourned. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.